There are moments when everything looks fine from the outside, the day is moving, the noise level is low, nothing is demanding you right now. You're sitting there, aware of your body, aware of the room. And still, something inside refuses to fully settle. Not enough to call it distress, just enough that rest feels slightly out of reach. It shows up in the smallest gaps. The pause after you finish one thing, and before the next begins. That brief second where nothing is required of you. Instead of softness, there's a subtle tightening, a sense of stay available. As if easing completely would mean dropping something important. Your attention keeps checking. Not frantically. Quietly. A thought passes by, then lingers a little too long. Another follows, not because it's urgent, but because it's there. You don't chase them, they simply don't leave. You replay moments that don't deserve this much space. A tone in someone's voice. A sentence you already answered. Not to fix anything, just to keep the line open. Your body remains still. But inside there's movement, a scanning forward and backward. As if staying oriented matters more than resting. Even in calm moments, there's a sense of being on standby. Your shoulders don't drop all the way. Your breath never quite reaches the bottom. You're present, but not fully unavailable. Like listening for a sound you're not sure you heard. You try to relax and notice the opposite happens. Not resistance, readiness. As if quiet needs monitoring. As if letting go too much could make you miss something you wouldn't know how to recover. It doesn't feel like overthinking. It feels like maintaining awareness. A gentle vigilance that blends into daily life, so well you forget it's even there, until the moment stretches, and the movement resumes on its own. You go through your day without trouble. You respond, decide, function, smile when needed. Nothing is breaking. But underneath, there's a constant sense of holding something together, not deliberately, not consciously, just enough to keep everything continuous. You wouldn't say your mind is racing. It feels more like it's braced. Not pushing forward, not pulling back, just staying slightly tense, as if waiting for permission that never quite arrives. And without noticing when it started, you keep breathing as if the next moment might require you to be ready. At some point, the old question starts to feel thin. You've repeated it so many times it no longer opens anything. What's wrong with me? It lands automatically, out of habit, then fades without giving you anything new. You notice how fast you've been blaming yourself. How quickly the experience gets framed as a personal failure. As if something inside you must be misfiring for this to keep happening again and again. But the more you sit with it, the less that explanation holds. If this were simply a mistake, would it be this consistent? If it were just a flaw, would it follow such a familiar rhythm? You begin to sense that the problem might not be where you've been looking, but how you've been asking. The old words don't quite fit anymore. They feel borrowed. Too blunt for something this precise. They point back at you, but they don't explain what's actually unfolding. So the question shifts. Not into an answer, but into a different direction entirely. Not why can't I stop this? But what keeps turning on? Not why do I do this to myself? But what continues, even when nothing is wrong? You notice patterns you hadn't questioned before. How the same sequence appears in quiet moments. How it activates without being invited. How it doesn't argue or demand. It simply starts. This no longer feels like a personal issue. It feels impersonal in a strange way. As if something is operating according to its own logic. Indifferent to whether you approve of it or not. You don't know what that logic is yet. You can't describe it. But you can feel that there is one. Something orderly enough to repeat. Stable enough to recognize. And without trying to change anything, you stop asking how to fix yourself. You pause, not to calm down, but to watch more closely. Because if something is running beneath all this, you want to see it clearly before deciding what it means. You start noticing it not as a problem, but as a movement. A thought appears, nothing special. Then another follows, close enough to feel related. Before the first one finishes fading, the second is already in place. Not rushing. Not forcing itself forward. Just continuing. Your attention shifts without being asked. From what just happened to what might happen next. From something said earlier to something that hasn't arrived yet. Memory slides into anticipation so smoothly, you barely register the handoff. It feels seamless, as if one naturally belongs after the other. You don't decide to do this. You notice it's already happening. A glance back. A glance forward. Then back again. The present moment doesn't disappear, but it thins out, like standing in a room while your eyes keep checking the hallway. You're still here, yet part of your attention keeps moving elsewhere. What's striking is how familiar the order feels. It's not random. It doesn't jump wildly. It follows a path you've walked countless times. Something from earlier resurfaces, not the whole scene, just a fragment. A tone. A pause. A detail that didn't matter much then, but seems to matter now. Before that finishes settling, your attention leans forward. What if this leads to that? The movement keeps its rhythm. Back, then forward. Forward, then back. Rarely staying long enough to feel complete. You begin to see that the thoughts themselves aren't the point. They pass quickly. What stays is the motion. It doesn't argue with you. It doesn't ask permission. It doesn't announce itself as concern or worry. It simply continues, like a conveyor belt that doesn't need supervision. Even when nothing new happens, the sequence keeps running. As if the absence of input is reason enough to check again. There's a strange neutrality to it. No panic. No urgency. Just continuity. And the more you watch, the clearer the pattern becomes. Not what the thoughts say, but how they arrive. Not their content, but their order. One leads to the next. The next points somewhere else. Then the cycle quietly resets. You don't feel trapped by it. You're simply seeing it. And somewhere in that seeing, a small recognition lands, not as a conclusion, just as a quiet acknowledgement. Oh, this always moves like this. As you keep watching, something shifts. Not in the movement itself, in how you relate to it. The loop no longer feels like a mistake. It doesn't look broken. It looks deliberate in a quiet way. As if it's doing a job you never formally agreed to, but have relied on for a long time. Each return to the past keeps a line intact. Each glance toward the future extends that line forward. Together, they form a thread thin, continuous, rarely noticed, that keeps things from breaking into pieces. Without that motion, there would be gaps. Moments without reference. Time without a clear owner. You start to sense that the loop isn't trying to solve anything. It's trying to maintain. To keep the sense of this is still happening uninterrupted. To make sure yesterday connects to now, and now has somewhere to go next. The idea of you appears inside this movement, not as a goal, but as a byproduct. A name that forms around continuity, not the other way around. When the sequence runs, there's a subtle reassurance embedded in it. Things are still linked. Nothing essential has been dropped. The line hasn't snapped. This isn't about control. It's about keeping shape. Keeping orientation. Making sure the story hasn't gone silent. Seen this way, the repetition loses its edge. It no longer feels like a personal failure. It feels more like a background function, steady, persistent, unconcerned with whether you approve. You didn't choose this role. It formed slowly, through repetition, through use, through the quiet assumption that continuity matters. And yet, noticing this doesn't bring relief. Not yet. There's still tension in the movement. Still a sense of holding on. But something important has shifted. You're no longer fighting the loop as if it were an enemy. You're beginning to see what would be at risk if it weren't there at all. The motion continues. The line stays unbroken. And for the first time, you stop asking why it won't go away and start wondering what it has been keeping together this whole time. You notice it the moment you try to make things quiet. When the day finally slows down and you expect something inside to ease, the opposite happens. There's a subtle urgency that appears. Not emotional. Structural. As if something important hasn't been secured yet. What you're feeling isn't restlessness. It's the need for things to stay connected. For the flow of moments to remain intact. For nothing essential to drop out of the sequence. That need comes before any sense of me. Before any story about who's thinking. Continuity first. Everything else forms around it. Because when things stay continuous, there's something to stand on. Something that feels stable enough to continue from. That's where the sense of I quietly takes shape, not as a cause, but as a result. So when you try to force stillness, the system doesn't hear calm. It hears interruption. Something might be getting lost. Something hasn't been checked. Something could break the line. The signal intensifies. Thoughts multiply. The loop tightens its grip. Not out of resistance, but out of urgency. You feel it as noise increasing. As pressure building exactly where you wanted relief. As if the harder you press for quiet, the louder everything becomes. This isn't because you're doing it wrong. It's because effort itself becomes new input. Another event that needs to be tracked, processed, linked. The attempt to stop the movement comes from inside the same system that creates it. So every push feeds the loop further. Not by intention. By design. Nothing here responds to force. Nothing here understands command. The structure only knows how to continue. And at some point, this becomes unmistakable. You're not failing to calm it down. You're pushing against something that reads pressure as danger. When that lands, even briefly, the struggle shifts. Not into relief, but into recognition. You see why effort hasn't worked. And for the first time, you stop mistaking that for a personal flaw. You start to notice something else. The movement isn't stubborn. It's precise. It doesn't ask who you are. It doesn't care whether you approve. It responds the same way every time certain conditions appear. This isn't personal. It never was. What's happening isn't a moral reaction. There's no judgment in it. No intention to help or hurt. Just a response that learned, over time, what kept things going. When continuity felt threatened before, this pattern activated. When uncertainty showed up, it stayed on longer. Not because it chose to, but because it worked. So it learned, quietly. Reliably. Protection here isn't an attitude. It's a function. A reflex shaped by repetition, not by decision. It doesn't know your story. It only recognizes signals, gaps, pauses, moments where the line might break. And when those signals appear, it does what it has always done. It moves. It checks. It connects one moment to the next. There's no sense of too much in it. No concept of excess. Only continuation. Seen this way, the pressure softens. Not because it stops, but because it's no longer misread. The movement isn't trying to dominate you. It's trying to keep something alive. Not you as a person, but the flow that makes experience feel uninterrupted. This intelligence doesn't speak. It doesn't negotiate. It doesn't respond to arguments. It simply runs until the conditions that shaped it are no longer present. Noticing this doesn't bring relief yet. But it brings space. The system doesn't need to be corrected. It doesn't need permission. It doesn't need forgiveness. It only needs to be seen for what it is. And when that lands, even briefly, the tone changes. The grip loosens without being forced. What remains isn't silence. It's softness. A sense that nothing here is against you. Nothing here is broken. Just a pattern doing what it learned to do, waiting not to be stopped, but to be understood. There's a point where nothing shifts outwardly. The same thoughts appear. The same movement continues. Yet something that was quietly tightening is no longer doing that. It's not relief the way people usually describe it. Nothing lifts. Nothing clears. There's just less effort involved in being here. The loop doesn't stop. It doesn't slow down to reward you. It keeps moving in its usual order. What's different is that it no longer feels like a responsibility. You notice you're not monitoring it anymore. Not because you decided not to, but because the impulse didn't arise. The thought appears, it passes, and there's no inner comment attached to it. No evaluation. No silent note saying this shouldn't be happening. That familiar reflex to correct, to manage, to fix doesn't activate. Not resisted. Not argued with. Simply absent. The movement no longer points back at you. It doesn't feel like evidence. It doesn't suggest something about who you are or how well you're doing. It's just movement. Memory surfaces. Anticipation follows. The sequence completes itself without pulling you into the center of it. You're not stepping away from it. You're not stepping into it either. The body remains where it is. Breathing continues without adjustment. There's no sense of holding posture inside. For the first time in a while, there's no internal demand to stay alert. No need to keep continuity intact. No sense that something important might be lost if you don't pay attention. Not because everything feels safe, but because the responsibility for safety is no longer sitting on you. The loop exists. It can keep existing. Nothing needs to be done about that. There's no satisfaction in this moment. No sense of success. Just the quiet disappearance of self-blame. You realize how much weight had been coming from that. Not from the thoughts themselves, but from taking them personally. Without that, the experience thins out. Not empty. Just lighter. You don't feel calm. You don't feel resolved. You feel unassigned. The sense of I am the one dealing with this doesn't form. The movement runs. And you remain where you are, not supervising it, not resisting it. There's no instruction appearing now. No step waiting to be taken. No feeling that this needs to be maintained. This isn't a state you arrive at. It's something that happens when nothing is being added. The loop may return later with the same rhythm, the same sequence. But the ownership isn't there. And without ownership, the weight that used to sit underneath everything is no longer present. Nothing closes here. Nothing opens. There's simply less of you in the way of what's already happening. Life doesn't pause to acknowledge what just shifted. The day continues in the same shape. Sounds return. Messages arrive. Small decisions still need to be made. Nothing announces that anything is different. And yet, something is. Thoughts still show up. They comment, compare, anticipate. The familiar movement hasn't disappeared. It wasn't meant to. What's thinner now is the pull. Thinking happens, but it no longer drags the whole moment with it. A thought can pass through without becoming the place you stand. You notice this in ordinary situations. While walking. While listening to someone talk. While waiting for something to finish. The mind moves ahead, then comes back. And you don't follow either direction all the way. Not because you stop yourself. Because there's no need to. Attention rests more easily in what's already here. Not anchored. Not fixed. Just less displaced. You're still capable of planning. Still able to remember. Those functions haven't gone anywhere. They simply don't claim ownership of the moment. There's a subtle difference in how time feels. Less urgency to secure it. Less pressure to keep it continuous. Moments don't need to connect perfectly anymore. If one ends, the next doesn't feel threatened by that. Nothing needs to be maintained. You don't hold on to this shift. You don't check whether it's still there. That would pull you back into managing again. Instead, life moves forward in a quieter way. Not calmer. Not clearer. Just less supervised. Thinking can appear in the background like sound from another room. Present, but not central. You respond when needed. You speak when spoken to. Actions still come from the same place. But they don't come with the added layer of self-reference. There's no sense of "I should stay like this." No concern about losing it. The difference is too subtle for that. It shows up as normalcy without friction. As if experience is allowed to unfold without constantly being checked against an internal standard. You're not trying to live differently. You're just living, with slightly less interference. And that's enough. Nothing concludes here. Nothing settles into a new identity. Life continues, and the mind continues with it, moving, responding, functioning without needing to pull you along for the ride. Nothing else is required here. This moment does not ask to be continued. It doesn't lean toward what comes next. It doesn't carry what came before. The space around you stays the same. Sound passes through it. Light remains where it is. Thoughts may still appear. They don't announce themselves. They don't ask to be followed or dismissed. The body is still present. Breathing continues without being guided. Time moves at its usual pace, without marking importance. There is no sense that anything has been completed. No internal signal saying something should be taken from this. Nothing here needs to be remembered in a particular way. What was seen earlier does not become a position. It doesn't turn into a reference point. It doesn't ask to be returned to. The movement that existed before can continue as it did. It doesn't interfere with what's happening now. It doesn't require attention. Nothing here pulls you forward. Nothing holds you in place. Silence passes. Sound replaces it. Neither asks to be noticed. There is no final frame forming. No boundary closing the view. No line marking an ending. This moment ends without instruction. Without emphasis. Another moment follows. Unrelated. Unaffected. Whatever comes next arrives on its own terms. It doesn't need to be named. It doesn't ask for agreement. And the day continues, not because anything was resolved, but because nothing needed to be.